Before beginning this episode, I would like to dedicate this video to Bob Weir, whose music and artistry helped shape the legacy of the Grateful Dead, and especially to my father, Bill, who introduced me to the band and helped spark my appreciation for their music and culture from an early age. I can't wait to jam with you when I'm home, Dad. What's up, everybody? My name is Will, and welcome to the Long Strange Trip Through Rock, a podcast series exploring the history of rock music through the albums and artists that helped shape it. Throughout this series, I'll be looking at the evolution of rock through the music of the Grateful Dead, one of the most unique and influential bands in American music history. Across these future episodes, I'll cover different Grateful Dead albums and how they reflected changing trends in rock, counterculture, live performances, and American identity. And later on in the series, I'll also look at Dead & Company and how the band's legacy continues to this very day. Rock music has always been more than just entertainment. It reflects politics, social movements, identity, rebellion, experimentation, and even changes in technology and culture. The Grateful Dead are especially important because they challenge traditional ideas about what a rock band was supposed to be. Instead of focusing on commercial radio success, the band built their reputation around live performance, improvisation, and community. For this very first episode, I'll be focusing on the Grateful Dead's 1970 album titled American Beauty, one of the most important albums in understanding both the band and the broader evolution of American music. American Beauty was released in November of 1970. And this became a major turning point because not only for the Grateful Dead, but for American culture in general. The optimism and chaos of the 1960s counterculture movement was slowly starting to fade. The Vietnam War continued to divide the country. Political violence and protests had become increasingly more and more common, and many artists began moving away from psychedelic experimentation toward a more stripped-down, traditional musical style. Now, before American Beauty, the Grateful Dead had already established themselves as pioneers of the psychedelic rock album through albums such as their debut album called The Grateful Dead, Anthem of the Sun, Ox O Moxoa, and Working Man's Dead. These records emphasized long improvisational jams, experimental studio techniques, and psychedelic soundscapes. However, with American Beauty, the band shifted towards a warmer and more roots-oriented sound built around folk, country, bluegrass, and a more traditional American songwriting. Now, the Grateful Dead themselves were formed in 1965 in Palo Alto, California, which is in the San Francisco Bay. They grew out of the folk and jug band scene, and they became central figures in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury counterculture movement. The band's most famous lineup, which is on the screen right now, included Jerry Garcia on lead guitar and vocals, Bob Weir on rhythm guitar and vocals again, Phil Lesh on bass, Bill Kreutzmann and Mickey Hart on the drums, Ron Pigpen McKiernan on the keyboards and blues vocals during their early years, and unfortunately Pigpen passed away, so the future keyboardists were Keith Godchuk and Brent Midland. Now, Jerry Garcia quickly became the symbolic face of the band, although he never really wanted to be the face of the Grateful Dead. He was considered the quote-unquote face because his improvisational guitar playing and his laid-back, mellow personality. Bob Weir, on the other hand, who's often referred to by fans as Bobby, brought a different style through unconventional rhythm guitar playing, vocal performances, and a unique style to his physical appearance that helped shape the Dead sound and culture, for lack of a better word. Phil Lesh, on the other hand, who originally came from the classical and avant-garde music background, approached bass playing in a way that was much more melodic and improvisational compared to a traditional rock bassist such as George Harrison from the Beatles. Together, the band created a musical style that felt unpredictable, collaborative, and deeply rooted in live performances, not studio. Their concerts became famous for extended improvisational jams where songs constantly changed from night to night. Unlike many rock bands of the era, the Grateful Dead treated songs less like fixed recordings and more like living performances. No two concerts ever sounded exactly the same, and audiences became a part of this experience. This eventually led to the rise of the Deadhead culture, as it's called, where fans traveled across the country following the band on tour. Yes, the country. Jerry Garcia himself especially became known for his relaxed stage presence and, like I mentioned before, his improvisational guitar style. This helped define the Grateful Dead's identity through the 1970s and beyond. On the screen right now is a picture of the area that the Grateful Dead was founded in, or they where they rose to prominence. In the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco. Now, anyway, what makes American Beauty especially interesting is that it represented a shift away from a more experimental, psychedelic sound of their earlier records. Instead, the album embraced folk, country, bluegrass, and traditional American songwriting. And this is one of the most important themes scholars and music critics discuss when analyzing a complex band like the Grateful Dead. Even though the band represented counterculture and rebellion, much of their music was deeply rooted in the traditional American styles. Rather than rejecting America's musical history, the Dead reimagined it. Musical historians often point out how the Grateful Dead complicated our understanding of rock music as a genre. Rock is usually associated with loud guitars, rebellion, commercial radio success, and appealing to the youth culture. However, the Grateful Dead blended rock with folk storytelling, country instrumentation, blues traditions, jazz improvisation, and a communal live performance. Their music often felt less polished and commercial than other major rock bands of the time, such as the Beatles or Led Zeppelin, just to name a few. Instead of trying to perfect songs for radio play, they instead emphasized spontaneous and interaction, or my bad, spontaneity and interaction between musicians. I apologize. Their concerts were built around improvisation and an unpredictability. You could hear two different songs. You could hear one song, one concert, but not hear it the next. Another major theme connected to the Grateful Dead is the community aspect. Unlike many artists who position themselves as distant celebrities, the Dead instead built a relationship with the fans that felt collaborative and family-like. Fans traded concert tapes, followed them on tour, and created this culture that blurred the line between performer and audience. And in many ways, the Grateful Dead helped create the blueprint for modern fan communities and the festival culture that we know today, like with Coachella, for an example. One song from American Beauty that captures many of these ideas is Friend of the Devil, and I will play a snippet for you right now. Give me 1 second. At first listen, Friend of the Devil may sound relatively simple compared to the louder and more aggressive rock music that was becoming more and more popular during the late 60s and early 70s. But that simplicity is actually part of what makes that song so innovative. Notice how relaxed the acoustic guitar was and how it's driven on the acoustical guitar. Instead of relying on distortion or heavy production, the song draws heavily from folk and country traditions. The arrangement creates a more intimate atmosphere that feels almost conversational. The lyrics also reflect older American storytelling traditions. The song tells the story of a wandering outlaw figure who is constantly escaping trouble and searching for freedom. Themes like gambling, running from the law, and life on the road connect the song to older folk ballads and country music narratives. Now, what makes the Grateful Dead's approach unique is how they combine these traditional themes with the spirit of psychedelic era rock culture. This song feels grounded in American musical history while still reflecting the freedom and unpredictability associated with the counterculture movement. Another important aspect of the song Friend of the Devil is actually how simple it is. In the studio version of the song, Jerry Garcia handles the vocals alone rather than relying on layered harmonies that appeared in many other Grateful Dead songs. That decision gives the track a more personal and intimate feeling. kind of like a traditional folk song around a campfire. The stripped down vocal performance also fits the song's storytelling style, and rather than sounding theatrical or overly polished, Garcia's voice feels relaxed and conversational, which matches the wandering outlaw narrative found in the lyrics. Even without large vocal harmonies or heavy production, the song still feels dead, It has that distinct dead sound because of its loose structure, its acoustic texture, and the emphasis on the atmosphere over the perfection of the song. Another song worth briefly mentioning is the song Truckin. Obviously, it's from the same album, American Beauty, which has become one of the Grateful Dead's most iconic songs. Here it is. Most of the cats that you meet on the streets speak of true love. Most of the time they're sitting and crying at home. One of these days, they know they gotta get going. Truckin' reflects another major aspect of the band's legacy, life on the road. The song mythologizes touring culture and freedom of movement, themes that became central to both the band's identity and Deadhead culture. One interesting detail about the song is that Bob Weir, referred to the fans as Bobby, as I mentioned earlier, contributes vocals alongside Jerry Garcia. This helps create the loose and communal vocal style that helped become a signature part of the Grateful Dead sound. And here is that in action. As you heard from the beginning of the clip, Jerry Garcia and Bob Weir were both singing at the same time. Rather than focusing on one dominant frontman, the Grateful Dead often approached vocals collaboratively, helping create the communal and conversational feeling that became one of the defining characteristics of the band's sound. The lyric, "What a long, strange trip it's been," eventually became symbolic not only of the Grateful Dead, but of the broader experience of the 1960s counterculture generation. By the early 1970s, the Grateful Dead had created something very different from traditional model of a rock band. They were less focused on commercial perfection and more focused on experimentation, improv, and community. Their influence can still be seen today in jam bands, music festivals, touring culture, and fan communities built around live performance. Ultimately, American Beauty remains one of the most important albums in rock history because it demonstrates how rock music could evolve by reconnecting with older American musical traditions while still pushing the genre of rock and roll forward. The Grateful Dead did not just change the sound of rock music, they changed the relationship between artists, audiences, and the performance itself. And even today, the music continues to live on through Dead and Company, who's on screen, where artists like John Mayer have helped introduce the Grateful Dead's music to a new generation of listeners while continuing the band's tradition of live improvisation and communal performance. Thank you so much for listening to episode 1 of Long Strange Trip Through Rock. My name is Will, and I will see you next time.